morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is Joshua Cagney, and on behalf of my organization, New Paradigm Recovery, and our co-sponsors, Inova Health System, Ashley Addiction Treatment, Caron Treatment Centers, Fusion Academy, Help in the Home, Lakeview Health, Skyland Trail, Sandstone Care, and National Capital Treatment and Recovery, I'm pleased to welcome you this morning to the February Community Connection series titled Modern Marijuana. Recent political changes in relation to marijuana are only part of the story. The world of drug policy has undergone immense changes in the past several years, and those changes manifest not just in policy, but also in the physical makeup of the cannabis plant and products derived from components of the plant. As public opinion has softened towards cannabis, the effects of consuming today's marijuana remain poorly understood. With increasing acceptance, often driven by corporate interests, use has steadily risen among all demographics. Cannabis use disorder is on the rise, and the changing makeup of the plant and its derivatives is making treatment more complex and challenging. Given these realities, the need for continuing education regarding the evolution of cannabis and new forms of consumption, as well as potential downsides, is extremely important. This conversation will be had in a respectful and non-political manner, promoting sound science while considering the practical reality of discussing cannabis in 2022 with a population that genuinely believes it's just weed. We're joined this morning by two people whose reputations and experience place them at the forefront of this issue. Their collective personal and professional experiences have helped mold much about how we understand the use of THC and the growing industry that exists in America today. Let me first introduce Ben Court of the Foundry Treatment Center at Steamboat. Ben's passion for recovery, prevention, and harm reduction comes from his own struggle with substance abuse. Sober since June 15th of 1996, Ben has been a part of the recovery community in almost every way conceivable, from a recipient to a provider to a spokesperson. Ben has a deep understanding of the issues and personal motivation to see the harmful effects of drug and alcohol abuse minimized. He's joined this morning by Kevin Sabat. Kevin is a former three-time White House Office of National Drug Control Policy Advisor, having been the only person appointed to that office by both a Republican under the George W. Bush administration and a Democrat, both the Barack Obama administrations and Bill Clinton administration. He's also an assistant professor adjunct at Yale University Medical School and a fellow at Yale's Institution for Social and Policy Studies, in addition to being a columnist for Newsweek. A few housekeeping items before we begin. We ask that everyone please stay muted during the entirety of the presentation. If you have any questions, we welcome them. I ask that you enter them into the chat, which is monitored, and those questions will be collected, and I will pose them to Ben and Kevin once they're done presenting. A link for continuing education credits will be posted in the chat and in a follow-up email, which will be sent to all attendees. So without further ado, I pass you off to Ben Court. And Ben, thank you again for joining us this morning.
Yeah, of course, Josh. Thanks for having me. I am really proud to be here and be a part of this with so many fantastic organizations. When one of my closest friends, Tom Walker, asked me if I'd be willing to do this as a favor for a bunch of his friends on the East Coast, I, of course, jumped on it and then asked Kevin if he would be willing to do this as a favor, and he is too. So just so everybody knows, all of Kevin's time for this has been very graciously given as well, which is quite a gift from somebody with Kevin's resume. It's funny, every time I do something with Kevin, we used to do so much more together publicly. Now we just kind of talk on the phone and catch up behind the scenes. I always got super self-conscious when they would read his bio because, you know, I'm like, yeah, I'm 43 and I'm like sort of proud of some of the things I've done in life. And then I hear him go through everything Kevin's done and I'm like, well, there you go. Like, might as well file for unemployment because I really haven't done much of anything. Really proud to have you and your insight here, brother. And if you are not familiar with that organization, it's one I've sat on the board for about 9 years, and strongly encourage you to go to that website, which I'm sure Kevin will have, and to learn about SAN because they're playing an extremely important role in this conversation. I am going to attempt to screen share. Josh, I can see you. Is this showing up? Can you give me a thumbs up or something?
Looks Looks good.
All right. So let us slideshow from the beginning. So what Kevin and I decided we were going to do was just each of us do like, 15, 20 minutes sort of introduction and tell you a couple of things from our perspective. And then we're going to answer questions, because it seems to me that this conversation is much, much better had when it's a dialogue. And a lesson that we've both learned over the last decade is that if people are willing to engage on this subject at more than just a quick elevator little speech, we can have some fantastically productive discussions, even when people come into it feeling a little bit differently about it, which is great. I mean, that's part of what makes this country so amazing is we can have and do get to have such differing opinions. But too often this is summarized in a soundbite. And the conversation, the subject is just way bigger than we're able to do that with. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what we know about weed and addiction. And that is going to be the very last time you are going to hear me say weed. I'm going to be talking about the new school cannabis, where I love this advertisement. I've been showing it to people for years and years because they say it better than I ever could. This is the new school cannabis. It's not what you smoked in the 70s. And I think finally at this point, everybody's kind of starting to realize that. We were jumping up and down and waving our hands for so long. Kevin and myself and hundreds of other people who had sort of been paying attention to this on the front end, but it seems like this is something we don't so much have to convince people of anymore. Enough people realize that we're dealing with a pretty different substance at this point. And the substance that we're dealing with, and where you're going to see my vernacular shift, is I'm going to just start referring to THC, which, as I would assume most of you know, is the psychoactive component inside of THC. There's 200 and some chemicals inside of THC before you light it on fire, 500 and some after you light it on fire. There are two of them we care a ton about. This is the one that we care about from the intoxication standpoint. If you don't have THC, you have hemp. I mean, you have a relatively benign, completely and totally benign textile base that was a pretty important part of the founding of this country and continues to make my favorite shoes, etc. It's just a pain in the butt because it's got a cousin that it looks like who tends to make some trouble. And so I'm shifting from everything, and I'm actually, because Kevin's now a book ahead of me, and his books are way, way better, by the way. If you're going to get one of our books, absolutely get his. I'm writing again, and the first chapter, all I'm doing is discussing the importance of our vernacular and how we must stop saying weed, cannabis, etc. for all these different areas that we're talking about. So I'm talking about THC, the part of the plant that gets you high. I think a lot of you also at this point have seen these data, and I won't go into how elegantly they were collected and how valid all of this is. With any luck, we're actually going to have an update on this later on this year. But essentially what you can see here is that beginning in 1960, and as these data were unfortunately impossible to collect from samples post 2011, you see the weed's gotten stronger. So the THC is the yellow line, the red line, and it's kind of slowly increased. And we actually can tell you what happened in the early 80s, sort of a cool story there, and then everything else. But the bottom line to it is, and what I tell everybody who kind of tries to dig too deep into this, the why. Well, one, we just got better at the farming side of this. Most of this is cloning and hydroponic growth, inverted hydroponic growth, etc. We just got better at growing and breeding this plant to make it stronger. But the reason why is really, really simple. Like, we live in the country that brought the world professional wrestling and supersized Big Macs. Like, if one is good, two is better. And every time I show videos or talk about the evolution of this plant, there's two different groups in the room. They're the people who see how strong and intense it is and watch people consuming it, and they say, "Oh dear God, why would a person ever want to do that?" And then there are people like me who are like, "Damn it, I can't believe I missed all that fun," because the stronger something is, the more it appeals to people like me, people who were always looking something to fill a gap with mental health issues, who had addictive disorder issues, who really, really wanted to get high and wanted to get as high as we could, as quickly as we could, so that we could tune all of it out and feel as normal as we thought we possibly could. So the reality is that we've increased in THC in this country because this is a country that just loves getting high. And if you don't believe that, I don't know, we're finally, as if heroin wasn't good enough, morphine wasn't good enough, we get heroin. Heroin's not good enough, let's find some fentanyl. Fentanyl's not good enough, let's get carfentanil. And don't worry, it's just going to continue to go up and up and up. If one is good, two is better in this country. Because the reality is that every one of these industries that deals in a vice substance is absolutely dependent on the problemed user. And I'm going to give you a little bit of data on that before I end here, but I need to say that again and clearly. And for whatever reason that people thought that this would be the exception to the rule, that bringing this into the corporate America, we'd somehow not do what we've done with every other addictive and intoxicating substance that there is. I think so many of us just checked our brains at the door. The vice substance industry needs the problemed user, period. So as I switch this slide, I want you to note on increments of 2.5 over a course of 50 years. The blue line is the state of Colorado, which unfortunately we lost the ability to report on because Colorado hasn't tested for potency or purity since 2015, as Kevin points out in his most recent book with a whistleblower who's talked about all this in the state. And I had to switch to increments of 5 just to get this on there. And if we took the Colorado Department of Marijuana Enforcement at its word in the 2020 report, which this isn't independently validated, so let's just say if we took them at their word, the average product in the state of Colorado would be 63% THC. So what I really like to ask people to consider is the reality that we dealt with for a long time. Y'all ever hear that old joke? Those of you who got high did. You ever hear that old joke that the most dangerous part about weed is getting caught with it? And you know, back in the 60s, 70s, 80s, we really were looking at a pretty benign substance. And I know that a lot of my colleagues and people who are more educated, probably smarter, will point out some inconsistencies with that. But for the most part, back when weed was less than 0.5% THC, 1%, 2%, because what naturally occurs is somewhere between 0.2 and 0.5. It really wasn't doing all that much bad stuff in the world. As it's gotten stronger and stronger, we have continued to see more and more issues. So cannabis and addiction is really simple. I'm going to skip to the bottom of this because I want to be done in about 5 minutes. As we have learned from 60 years of data out of the SAMHSA has given us, that 80-20 rule really matters. And that's the rule that says that about 80% of the booze in this country is consumed by about 20% of the consumers, that the American alcohol industry has never cared about my wife, who didn't have her first drink till she was in her mid-20s and has a couple margaritas a year. What they needed was the guy who found Mad Dog 2020 when he was 12 years old. They needed the problemed user. So the last data that we have out of Colorado from 2020, from the annual report from the Marijuana Enforcement Division, shows us that 6.1% of the users in Colorado purchased 75.7% of the THC. Just to give you some perspective, in Colorado, the taxed market was $2.1 billion. So that year, so in 2020, 75% of that $2.1 billion was purchased by 6% of the users. When I ask for a profile of those users, a lot of the times people start to throw out ages and whatever, or I say, you know, who do they think they are? And they're like, oh, it's tourists. No, it's not tourists at all. The Colorado cannabis industry could give half a shit about those of you coming out to ski, grabbing a couple gummies on your way up to Breckenridge. We do not need you. What we need is the person who meets 6 or more criteria for a substance use disorder, which is how we determine addiction. Because the people who are consuming that 6%, or I'm sorry, that 75%, are people who in almost every situation would meet the diagnostic criteria for a severe substance use disorder. The reality is that Kevin and I and a lot of you who work in this field will keep getting asked by people, do you really think marijuana is addictive? Is it? Could it be? And I like to answer that. I've been saying the same thing for a decade on it. When people say, do you think THC is addictive? I say, well, I think THC is addictive in the same way that I think Wyoming lies directly north of Colorado. It's not an opinion. We're looking at objective diagnostic criteria. It's more addictive than some things, less addictive than others. Here's the little bit we know about THC and addiction. And for those of you professionals, I'd encourage you to buy a medical textbook published by Springer called Cannabis and Medicine, an Evidence-Based Approach, to which Dr. Letitia Bader and I co-authored the chapter on treatment and recovery. And here's lots and lots of research in a big chapter summarized really quickly. THC and addiction is very real, and it is not at all easy to treat. Those of you who work on it and treat it know that. It often requires very long stays in treatment, as well as working with pharmacologic interventions to get a person to stable. And as those of you who know work in treatment, insurance companies are never too psyched about covering stays for THC dependence. So it's hard with the amount of time we need versus what they usually give us. Traditional rates of addiction to THC were roughly 10%. So that is everybody, if you take everybody who consumes at some point in their life, roughly 10% of them at some point will meet the diagnostic criteria for substance use disorder. A giant meta study from 2020 actually showed us that in a matter of 8 years, it's gone from 10% to 30%. So 1/3 of everybody who uses today's THC products will at some point in their life meet the diagnostic criteria for a substance use disorder. That's objective data. And that should be a little bit scary for a lot of us. The other thing is that the actual physical dependence on THC, again, I'm not telling you who work in this field anything new. The physical detox associated with this is rough. And if you want to read that chapter Dr. Bader and I wrote, you'll see some of our ideas on the why, but it makes the maintained abstinence from very, very difficult and makes it hard for us treatment providers to do it. We actually, those of you know Tom Walker, one of my best friends who has moved out here to work with me, we're actually in the process of, with any luck, we're going to put out a cannabis specific inpatient treatment program. And we're going to go out of network because insurance companies suck at this. So listen, these last couple fun little visuals before, we'll take you 2 minutes. So get ready, Kev. The reality, you guys, is that the products have reached this. If you can see this screen, we have concentrates now reaching up to 99.9% pure THC. And the scary thing is that when you ask medical professionals, the scientific community, when you say, so what happens to the human brain and body at about a 20% THC level? The answer is a collective shrug. Because it's happened so quickly, we just don't know yet. And we will have that information before too long. And we can tell you, it doesn't look good. It really doesn't look good. But the difference between the person 20 years ago who was smoking 2, 3, 4%, and the person who's consuming these 99% pure distillates, this is called, is pretty profound. They are, they look like this. I grew up in the greater DC area in the mid 90s, and most of you have a different frame of reference for a drug like me. When you see this, when you see something this pure, this is what won the Cannabis Cup last year. This is what your patients are referring to when they say weed. And I think for those of us who continue to see an organic green material, a flowering plant in our minds, we got to shift, because it is about the THC, the concentrated THC, not just the cannabis. This is it in its pre-cooled form. And I just encourage you to consider the acumen it takes to go from a green organic material to something like this. So I will leave you with this, you wonderful professionals in this field who are on the front lines and doing the hardest of the hard work. That one of the most challenging things, I think, for many of us, especially those of us who are in recovery, who have interacted with, who had an uncle, a dad, or whatever, our mom used, one of the most challenging things for us is realizing that our reality is so very different from the reality of those that we are working with today. If we continue to talk to them about, learning how to drive on something that maybe go 30 miles per hour downhill, and they've been ripping around town at 220 in a Bugatti, we will miss them. And if we miss them, we will continue to lose opportunities for intervention, for healing, for sobriety, for prevention. So let's, if I could ask you to do one thing, it would be to commit to learn a little bit more about today's THC so that we can better meet the needs of those who we work with. That is the end. I will turn it over to a much greater mind. Dr. Sabet, you're up, brother.
Well, that's very difficult to follow. It's really nice to see my good friend Ben and bringing an incredible perspective that I think has really woken a lot of people up, especially in the treatment and recovery, but also law enforcement and beyond. And I'm just proud to call Ben a friend, and really excited that he invited me on here. So thank you, brother. I want to thank everybody. I want to thank Josh for that introduction, and really everyone who's on, all the sponsors, everyone who made this possible. It's a privilege to be in front of you. Like Ben said, I want to speak for a little bit, and then I hope we can get into a Q&A. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here if it lets me. Yes, it does. And we're going to get right started. So let's see. Here we go. So real quick, what is SAM, the organization that I started with Ben 9 years ago? I left the White House in 2011 and felt that there was a need for a voice in this issue of marijuana, a voice that was nonpartisan, but a voice that was scientific, and a voice that really was trying to break through this false dichotomy between criminalization and legalization, as if those were our only two options. And I worried back then, as I still do, that the lack of leadership and voice on this issue, marijuana, is really allowing very dangerous ideas to be perpetuated because they're filling that gap. And it's too easy to ignore marijuana, especially in light of the opioid crisis, the addiction crisis, the stimulant methamphetamine issues that are around this country. It's very easy and convenient to sort of say, well, marijuana, I'm not really that interested in it. There's other things that are more important. And I hate to say it, but folks in our field, generally in drug policy and drugs, they have done that. They have. That's why I'm so grateful to the organizers of today, because you're not doing that. But really, it's been very easy to sweep all of this under the rug. And we have kind of taken the bull by the horns to say, this is an issue we need to talk about, not in a reefer madness, kind of way, or a way that is penalizing people and criminalizing people, but in an intelligent and a smart way, in a way that's science-based, and, by the way, in a way that does not repeat the horrific mistakes of the past that we have made with regards to our legal drugs, which really, if they're examples of anything, they're examples of destruction, capitalism gone wild, despair, heartbreak, family loss. On and on and on. Those are the last models we'd ever want to look at. But unfortunately, there's a whole movement that does want to look at that model and wants to perpetuate that. So that's why we started SAM. We collaborate with all the major medical associations and folks that are willing to kind of step up. And so that kind of has validated a lot of our work. But really what I want to underscore what Ben said about the car and what Ben is saying about THC. The best analogy I've heard from a scientist is a guy named John Calkins, who's probably the smartest person in this field, who's a policy analyst. Basically, he's a mathematics and operation research professor who, thank God, likes to dabble in drug policy, because we're all smarter as a result of that. But he could do anything he wanted. He talks about a comparison of the typical marijuana user 20 years ago versus the typical marijuana user today. And essentially, the typical marijuana user 20 years ago was consuming the amount of THC that you could say would be equivalent to the caffeine in a 20-ounce bottle of Coke. versus fast forward 20 years to today, and the average consumer has gone from that 20-ounce Coke to 33 Starbucks cappuccinos worth of caffeine. That is the difference that we're talking about when we talk about the consumption, what today we are really looking at. And this is why people just, I think, often don't get it, is that they don't really understand. They think, as Ben was saying, that we're talking about Woodstock weed, that we're talking about, you know, what you smoked in college in the early 80s occasionally. And really we're not. We're talking about something that's orders of magnitude different. And I personally really like that analogy. I'm going to start with this notion that marijuana, you know, loosening marijuana laws and becoming relaxed on it is about social equity, because we've been hearing a lot about that. We've been hearing a lot about, rightfully so, the issues related to social justice and the war on drugs. And unfortunately, marijuana has been very much tied into that. And I will tell you, I didn't realize it, that's my book on the right, Smoke Screen, which I will talk about at the end. But you know, if you really want to understand social justice with this issue, we need to understand how perpetuating addiction actually perpetuates social justice. And let me tell you why. First of all, if you thought marijuana arrest rates went down in legalized states and weren't hurting people of color still, you're wrong. It has not changed that. Again, we're told the reason why we should loosen policies for social justice. But when that policy is loosened, we're not gaining social justice. The guys making money from pot legalization.
Just a second.
They're guys that look like people like me and Ben, to be honest with you. They are not people of color that are making the money. We are foolish to think that people who are poor, who's the corner dealer with no connection, with no legal connections, with no legitimate bank account or relationship with a loan officer, is going to all of a sudden start some multi-state pot business and make money. And guess where the pot shops are all congregating? They are congregating in areas where there are high numbers of people of color. We should not be surprised at any of this, given what we see with liquor stores, right? And what we see with alcohol. So when we see the density of these pot shops, they're not going to a lot of the upper class areas. Of course, there's some of that, but the vast majority are disproportionately in city centers, urban centers, and people where they have low income. By the way, your drug dealer has not gone out of business, is the other thing I like to tell people after we legalize marijuana. The illegal market is getting worse. I mean, the New York Times has admitted that. Multiple studies have admitted that. This may sound counterintuitive, but it's true. When you legitimize and legalize something, you actually perpetuate the illegal market because you're increasing the demand for the drug. And the illegal market is able to adapt and evade law enforcement very easily in a legal regime. And that's what's happening. We're not seeing like cartels by any means get smaller by what's happening at all. And the reason is this demand has ballooned in this country in a way that we could not have predicted. In the early 90s, we had 900,000 people out of everyone in the country, 900,000 who were using marijuana almost every day. That number has ballooned to about 15 million people. I mean, that's a remarkable change. That's a remarkable difference in such a short amount of time, in 30 years. And again, it's something that often is not talked about, because I'm not talking about the occasional user, although occasional use can be harmful. We look at psychotic episodes. We're not going to be talking a lot about that today, but mental health, schizophrenia, there's a study out today saying occasional marijuana use among kids increases your risk of schizophrenia 6-fold. That was just out today. It's on my Twitter feed if you want to see it. The point is, these are huge issues with occasional use. However, imagine the issues with daily and near daily use. And if we only focus on daily or near daily use, you're looking at 15 million people. That's a lot of people that are being affected. And they're part of what I call the addiction for profit model. What does that mean? Well, that's the model that big tobacco and big alcohol have used, and big pharma. I mean, let's be honest about big pharma for a second, if we can. This horrendous opioid problem that we've had, which now is a fentanyl problem, that problem of overprescribing and not misuse, prescription misuse, that didn't happen because everyone who was prescribed OxyContin abused it. That's not what happened. What happened was about 20% of people prescribed OxyContin misused it. And that 20% caused this massive crisis. The point being, you don't need everybody to be misusing something for there to be a crisis. And that's what's happening with marijuana. You have about 30% of users, this is from Colorado, that consume 87, that's the 67 and 20, 87% on the right bar of the entire volume of marijuana, right? So it's a small number of people who consume a lot, and that makes this industry a lot of money. And we have seen that, of course, over and over again. We've seen that with tobacco. Let's be real about tobacco for a second, folks. 100 years ago, 120 years ago, tobacco was not very harmful. I mean, let me just be honest with you. Tobacco has been used for thousands of years, and it was a mild lung irritant. But when big tobacco took over and started industrializing cigarettes, mass producing them, putting something called nicotine in it, putting something called all the carcinogens in it, that's when it became deadly. When industry got involved, that's happening all over again with marijuana. It is becoming deadlier because of the legal industry. And big tobacco itself is chomping at the bit with marijuana because this is a way for them to rebrand. This is a way for them to become cool again. I mean, let's be honest, smokers aren't cool. The Marlboro Man right now isn't cool, but a celebrity smoking a joint or dabbing, he's cool. And the big tobacco knows that. And so that is the point with this industry trying to take over. And we have a whole list of, if you want to go into details, where we have profiled these industries. What is Altria? Altria is Philip Morris. What is Juul? Juul started as a marijuana company. Many people don't know that. They spun off called PAX, but it's the same company. What is Imperial Brands? It's the fourth largest tobacco company in the world. Philip Morris speaks for itself, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. These are all companies getting into big pot. How is that going to end in anything other than tears? I can't understand. This is not a partisan issue. When you have every major medical association, including the Surgeon General for both President Obama and President Biden, saying marijuana is addictive, saying that public policy is totally outpacing the science, you know that we're on to something here. We're not just, this isn't BS, this isn't rhetoric, this isn't, just, political talking points. This is the science. This is the science. This is real. This is not a partisan issue. It never should be. And again, but unfortunately, the American people have been perpetuated this big lie. What has been the result in states? Well, we have an increase in poison exposures happening in multiple states. What's happening with taxes? They're a drop in the bucket, folks. A drop in the bucket in terms of the revenue, because people always say, well, the revenue is great. Not only is it a drop in the bucket, what has been the cost of these policies? Very few people are counting the costs. We should count the costs. We should count what it costs society when you get into a car crash and you're high on weed. We should count the cost of every time you have to go to the emergency room because you've consumed an edible that you didn't realize had so much THC in it. We should count the cost of missing school because you're waking and baking every day. We should count the cost of employers. I mean, on and on and on, but these states aren't interested in counting the costs. We have the hospitalizations skyrocketing in states. Why? Because it's THC poisoning. Our bodies, we are not used to this level of THC that we have. And please don't think you're getting regulated marijuana if you go to a legal store. States are not meant to regulate drugs, folks. We do not have something called the California FDA. We just have the FDA. And half the time the FDA is behind the curb. What can we imagine that 50 states are going to be able to regulate something that's been illegal since that state has entered the union? Forget about it. It's not happening. We have pesticides, molds, bacteria. So if somebody thinks they're buying something on a regulated market, we're not seeing any regulation at all. Workplace issues skyrocketing, which is a huge concern, especially in a labor market like this. And car crashes, as I was saying. I mean, every week a study comes out about car crashes. One just came out. We can't keep up. I got to be honest with you. We cannot keep up with the science. My staff is going to kill me because I always forward the latest science and I say, we got to make a slide. We got to make a slide. And they're like, hey, sir, we have 2,000 slides. I mean, how many slides are we going to show people? And they're right. I mean, it's endless. And by the way, we're meant to think that because marijuana is illegal, we don't know anything about it. That is a huge myth. It doesn't mean we shouldn't do more research. Listen, I'm a PhD. I love research. We should do a lot more of it. But the idea that we don't have research because something is illegal is a complete falsehood. Studies, JAMA Internal Medicine, saying if we were to legalize, we'd have at least 7,000 more deaths annually. And this issue about public opinion is very interesting. When you ask a voter if they want legalization or not in this country, about 60% of them say yes, they do. So it's like 60-40. But when you actually give people choices and say, what about just decriminalization, or just proper medical use? I'm not talking about medical use right now. If you have questions, I'm happy to talk about medical use. Because there is legitimate medical use and there's illegitimate medical use. That's the cheat sheet there. But the bottom line with the polling is that the majority of Americans, when given choices, they actually don't want tobacco style commercialization, but that is what they're getting right now. I'm going to spend my last minute talking about something I wasn't going to talk about, but I think with you all and with this audience, it would be really imprudent not to talk about it. Folks, I have a bridge to sell you. If you think that this whole movement of normalization ends with marijuana. Unfortunately, I wish it did, because as bad as marijuana is, the idea of Marlboro, Philip Morris selling methamphetamine is even scarier to me, okay? But, it sounds crazy to say something like that even, but frankly, 30 years ago, if you were to say that we would have 99% THC lollipops available online for any 12-year-old to purchase with absolutely no oversight, I would tell you you're crazy too, but it's happening. So we have to be prepared for everything. And the next frontier in this whole issue is not legal marijuana. That's already happening. It's legal heroin, methamphetamine, fentanyl, on and on and on, cocaine. This doesn't end with marijuana. And you have a global movement funded in large part by a lot of billionaires who are saying the war on drugs has failed. Therefore, we need a new approach. And I don't dispute that notion that we need a new approach. I don't dispute that notion that we have to do something different. We have over 100,000 people dying. But the new approach, how they're defining that new approach, is the legalization of all drugs. And they're starting with things, I don't know if we have any friends in Oregon today, they're starting with things like the Oregon decriminalization measure. I don't know how many of you know this. Data just came out this morning. Do you know how many people have been referred to treatment since they've decriminalized drugs? And they said that it was about treatment over incarceration. Do you know how many people have been referred to treatment? Less than 0.7% of anybody going through the system right now. So this isn't about treatment at all. This is about the legalization of all drugs. And I'm just being real with you. Right now, I'm actually dialing in on Zoom from a beautiful place. I'd say it's the most beautiful city in North America, maybe. And Ben might even agree, even though he's from a really awesome part of the country. It's a little city called Vancouver, British Columbia. And in Vancouver, British Columbia, the place where they've had an injection site for 20 years, they have really only emphasized harm reduction. They haven't emphasized anything else. Basically, they have very little treatment. Prevention is almost unheard of. What has happened over the last 20 years? What has happened is that they have the largest overdose problem in the Western Hemisphere, more than the US, more than states like West Virginia, more than states like Massachusetts, New York, California, Colorado, San Francisco. And again, there are a lot of factors there, but we got to put the brakes on this idea that we should basically legalize all drugs. And that is where we are going with marijuana. So we're trying to educate folks at SAM. We have resources for you. If you go to our website, we have our annual big sort of centerpiece of the website is our lessons learned document, which tells you all the we have all the stats compiled from all of the states. You can go to learnaboutsam.org. I did write a book, and I'll give a little push for it. It came out on 4/20 this year or last year, and that was on purpose, called Smokescreen: What the Marijuana Industry Doesn't Want You to Know, where I kind of did an in-depth sort of investigation of the industry, and I talked to many people in the industry, out of the industry, people in recovery, treatment providers, people going through, the hell of what it is to go through with a marijuana use disorder, parents spending their life savings to get their kid treatment. I mean, horrible things. I learned even more, even though I've been in this field a while. So you can find that book anywhere on Amazon or whatever. You can get involved with us. We do training events. We do webinars like this. We have this affiliate program. We have, would love for you to, there's donation, volunteer opportunities, board opportunities, and you can just contact us, Brendan, my colleague, Brendan at learnaboutsam.org, or just from our contact on the website. So I want to thank you so much. And I'm really excited to get into any questions or discussion. Thank you.
Kevin, thank you very much. I truly appreciate that. And I don't know if I'm echoing concerns or thoughts that other people have, but I'm actually having a physiological response and reaction to a lot of what you and Ben have shared this morning. And we do have a number of questions. I'm going to start initially with a question that I have, and I'm going to provide some context for this. Obviously, there are opinions and insights that vary across the spectrum in terms of how THC is presented in the United States, what the long-term effects are, what the short-term effects are. And one person in particular I'm thinking of is Drew Pinsky, who has presented marijuana as a potential solution to the opioid issue in America, as a way of being able to treat pain and apply it medically. So when we think about that, what are practical medical applications of THC?
Well, it's a great question. Actually, Dr. Drew is a friend of mine and wrote the quote for my first book called Reefer Sanity: 7 Great Myths on Marijuana. I think he's pretty good on these issues. But I'll give you the elevator on the speech on marijuana, medical marijuana. There are medical components of the marijuana plant is highly complex. Let's just start from that. It has hundreds and hundreds of components in it. They're called different things. One thing they're called is cannabinoids. Those act on receptors in the brain and body. There are things that we don't understand called flavonoids. There are things called terpenes, which give the smell. There are all kinds of things in the marijuana. It's a much more complex plant than, say, the opium poppy or the coca plant. What does that mean? It means that there are components that we know could be helpful for therapeutic application. Well, what do we mean by that? Well, in some ways, we've seen mainly not so much the cause of disease, for example, helping, but with symptoms related to certain things. So actually, THC in its synthetic form has been a Schedule III drug for 30 years for people with nausea related to cancer chemotherapy, and people with a very specific kind of pain, not the pain that most people have, but what we would call neuropathic pain, cancer pain. It's a very specific kind of pain. And that's been approved for that for 30 years. Is it often prescribed, to be honest with you? No, it's not. We have much better drugs than the marijuana class of drugs. But it is out there. We have CBD oil that has been standardized into nabiximols, otherwise known as Epidiolex as a trade name. Epidiolex has been legal for about 3 or 4 years, and that is for a small number of people who do not respond well to traditional anti-seizure medications. It's not a first-line medication. It's a medication for those that don't respond well. That's around. And I think there's potential for a lot of other things. I mean, I don't think it's inconsistent to say we're worried about high potency THC for non-medical use, but at the same time, we see potential with components of marijuana for proper medical use. Let me tell you, my issue is the issue related to voting on medicine. Okay, voting on medicine. I think that's a very bad idea. No disrespect to politicians or the public electorate, but unless you are you have a PhD in, whether it's psychopharmacology or biopharmacology or whatever, some of these fields, you are not qualified to determine whether a medicine should be legal. Now, that doesn't mean that you're not, as an individual, like not qualified to try something, even if you don't know because you're desperate. That's a whole other thing. But the idea that we're making blanket public policy and starting dispensaries, I mean, can you imagine if we had Advil dispensaries or morphine shops? I mean, it doesn't, you get morphine from a pharmacy. You get Advil from a pharmacy, usually, even though that's over the counter. But you don't go to a special store that also sells t-shirts, bongs, and 99% dabs. So I just don't like how that was done. I think it was very deceitful. I think it's terrible precedent to whoever has the most money, whatever interest group has the most money. Forget the FDA. I mean, let's look at the COVID vaccine. Let's forget the FDA on that. Why don't I just run a ballot initiative in a state suffering from high levels of COVID-19 and say that I have a wonderful solution to COVID-19, and if I can convince 51% of the people, you can go and use it for that. I don't think that's right. I don't think that's how medicine's done. But again, there is application. We know about other cannabinoids. There's CBG, there's THCA. I mean, I could spend the whole time talking about the names of them. There is potential, and some people are experimenting on themselves. I have no actual issue with that, especially if you have a chronic condition that you haven't had relief for. My issue is blanket public policy and also being deceitful about intentions, because let's be very honest, the minute you medicalize something in a state, the campaign to legalize is right behind. So again, it's a nuanced view. Medical application, yes. By the way, for opioids and for opioid pain, the evidence is very thin, if non-existent. I didn't show those slides today, but we have study after study after study actually saying that unless you're talking about a very particular kind of pain, when you look at these in controlled studies, and if you're looking at as substitutes for opioids, it's not there, it's not happening, and it is a very poor substitute for other pain medications.
I appreciate that very much, Kevin. Ben, do you have anything that you want to weigh on with this question?
No, I will echo the dangers of voting for medicine. That's it. I believe that individually we're pretty smart people. Collectively, I can't believe our society has made it as long as we have. We don't have the greatest track record for voting well. I mean, we thought that dude from The Apprentice would be a good president. And if I just pissed you off and you're like, what about now? Okay, then we thought that Joe Biden would be a good president. Like, this is stuff Kevin can't say because he's actually a professional, and he's just because 50% of people think something doesn't make it true. Leave medicine to the docs.
I appreciate that, Ben. Another question, and this one is near and dear to my heart. Like you, Ben, I'm not just a professional in the industry, I'm also in recovery as well, and alcohol was ultimately the drug that brought me to my knees. If we look at the fatalities and addiction issues associated with alcohol, what is the relative comparison when we talk about THC?
Oh, I love that question. Ben, you start.
Me too. I mean, just the heart of it. Not even kind of sort of on the same page when it comes to numbers, hundreds, thousands to one. Alcohol is, I mean, for all we talk about opiates and everything, it's the most damaging substance in this country several times over. So let us now ask why. Is alcohol as damaging as it is to this country because it is fundamentally worse than these other substances? And my argument to that is absolutely not. Alcohol is fundamentally worse and more damaging, more harmful because of how widely accepted and widely available it is. And that because behind every bottle of liquor we buy are a bunch of senior executives making 6-7 figures trying to figure out how to sell as many of those as possible. Alcohol doesn't do what it does in this country because it's fundamentally worse. Alcohol does what it does in this country because it is more fundamentally accepted and normalized. And my biggest fear with this, as well as with what Kevin said, the other drugs, and listen, you're just going to have to do the research yourself, read exactly what these people have written or take our word on it, because we've been doing this for a long time. The idea behind all of this is to sell more to the problemed users. And my biggest fear when I saw all this with weed was, well, damn, we're going to have something that wasn't much of an issue become a great big giant issue, because now you're going to have the alcohol manufacturers behind it, which you do. I mean, Kevin can give you all of those data. So listen, alcohol kills, hurts, destroys infinitely more lives than cannabis at this point. But I don't believe it's because it is a fundamentally worse substance. I believe it is because it is a fundamentally wider, it's a ratio. It's a wider consumed, earlier consumed issue. Kev?
Well, Ben is right. When you look at why something is deadly, let's look at alcohol versus heroin. Okay. Heroin is used by about 1/1000th of the number of people or more who use alcohol. Okay. So if you were to say, what's worse, alcohol or heroin? Well, from a societal point of view, there's no contest. Of course it's alcohol. It kills 100,000 people a year. It's the number one drug with criminality. On and on, a number one drug on the roads. On and on and on. There's no question. If you were to ask on the individual level, would you rather have a shot of vodka, that's not vodka, or a syringe with heroin in it? You have to take one. Well, you're going to take the shot of vodka, probably. Well, unless you really want the high from heroin, it's a much better high. But in terms of your safety, you're going to take the alcohol way before you're going to take the heroin. So on the individual level, heroin is much deadlier. On the macro level, alcohol is much deadlier. Why is that? Well, like Ben said, a lot of that is because it is used so much more. That's what makes it deadly. We have to understand, when you commercialize, promote, and legalize something, that itself changes the dangerousness of the drug, really on a macro and a micro level. I argue with marijuana, it's both, because when you legalize it on the macro level, more people use it. On the micro level, the industry innovates and comes up with all of these kinds of products that they wouldn't have come up with. You can say what you want about Mexican marijuana cartels. They didn't come up with the pot gummy bear that's poisoned 1 million kids in the last 10 years. They just didn't. They didn't come up with the 99% dabs that have been direct causal links to suicide among several young people. They just didn't. They did a lot of bad things. They destabilized democracy. They chop people's heads off. They've hung them in the freeway. I'm not saying they're doing good things. But in terms of the micro level to the user, the industry has been much deadlier than any drug dealer has been on the micro level. So when you allow something, you change it. Again, when you allow something, it doesn't mean, or when you don't allow something, I should say, it doesn't mean that you think that no one's ever going to do it or use it. And if they do, then that is a failure. There were some questions in the chat about decriminalization versus legalization. And the way I see it like kind of like a speed limit. Okay. We need speed limits. Okay. But raise your hand, and you don't have to really raise your hand, but think about if you've ever sped before. Probably most of us have. We've violated the law. We have sped before, and speeding is a huge issue on freeways, and it causes crashes. And every day there's car crashes as a result of speeding. Does that mean we should get rid of speed limits because people speed? No. Of course not. In fact, most people who speed won't get into a car crash, but we still have speed limits. Marijuana, it's the same thing. Most people who use it, they're not going to have a problem, actually. In fact, most people who try marijuana, big secret here, they don't like it. They don't like it. They stop using it. Other people use it for a month or a year in college, and they stop. Then a smaller percentage go on to cannabis use disorder. Unfortunately, cannabis use disorder percentages are growing every year because of the THC. We're now at about 30% of past year users have a cannabis use disorder. That's a big, big number, but it's still a minority, okay? So, but that doesn't mean, again, same thing with speeding. a minority of people speed, but they get into a car crash. That we don't get rid of speed limits as a result. So that's the kind of thinking. And decriminalization is about individual, not criminalizing people for use. It's not, so we don't want to give people a criminal record so they can't get housing and healthcare and benefits. We don't want to do that. We don't want to ruin their lives over, you know, something that if you're rich, you can get out of. I mean, that's just, it doesn't make sense. But legalization is very different than that. Legalization is the commercialization. Legalization is the promotion. Legalization is actually encouraging. Whereas I think drug policy personally should be about discouraging. Speed limits discourage speeding. They don't stop all speeding. They're not magic bullets. And you can speed and not get into an accident. I mean, let's be honest about it. Same thing with marijuana, but we should be discouraging. The last thing on alcohol is that sometimes people like to compare alcohol versus marijuana on other physiological issues. They're very different. Alcohol affects the liver, marijuana affects the lungs. Alcohol and marijuana affect the brain and the brain activity in very different ways. Alcohol, as far as we know, is not linked to some of the mental illness that we're seeing with drugs like methamphetamine and marijuana. Marijuana is not linked to some of the brain damage or other things that alcohol would be linked to. So I really think that when we start comparing one to one, we're in very dangerous territory. It's not really scientific territory. I don't think it's very helpful. And finally, I just will say, the only reason to use marijuana other than for medical use is to feel a high from it. I mean, that's the point. You use it so you get the effect of the THC, which binds to the receptors. That's the only reason you drink alcohol, is not to get drunk. And so there is a difference there. Most people don't have marijuana with their steak. That doesn't usually enhance the flavor. And the other thing I'll say about alcohol to end it is alcohol, for better or worse, and I would argue for worse, we're stuck with alcohol. What do I mean? I mean that it's been part of Western civilization for 7,000 years, the majority of people using it. Marijuana was used 7,000 years ago, but not by the majority of civilization, not by the vast majority of the US or Western culture. And the reason why alcohol prohibition was an experiment 100 years ago was not sustainable, was not because it failed in all metrics. Actually, I don't know if you all know this, alcohol prohibition drove down deaths, especially among white men, by major numbers, and it drove down cirrhosis of the liver by major numbers. It was not a public health failure. The reason we can't have it is not because of that. It's because too many people drink. 70% of people wanted to drink. You can't make something illegal that the vast majority of people want to do regularly on a regular basis. Even today, with the high numbers of marijuana use, we don't have more than 50% of people using. We have about 25% or 20%. So there's a cultural difference we're sort of stuck with. But I think, if anything, that's an example of why we don't want to be stuck with something else. It's not an example of copying that model. That model has been a public health disaster of alcohol.
So stopping short of asking you guys to be prognosticators, do you have, yeah, Ben, I'm sorry.
I got to correct Kevin real quickly, which is a hard thing to do because he's not wrong, but he was in two things. One, you can tell Kevin's a good human being and has lived a good life because the steak way does taste better. And two,
corrected.
And two, I would argue that everybody has sped except for my dear friend Sarah McDade, who I see on the hello, Sarah, I owe you a phone call. Other than that, sorry, Josh, go ahead.
Sarah is an exception to a lot of rules. I'd agree with you on that. So stopping short of asking you guys to act as prognosticators, do you have a concern about the fact that if we look at the growing demand and supply, and I was in economics undergrad, so any economics questions I'd love to dive into. Are you concerned that we're going to see the increase in supply and demand that we've seen with alcohol over the course of the last 100 years since prohibition ended occur in the cannabis industry as well, where we're going to push demand by increasing a supply through a commercialized market?
We're already seeing it. I mean, the short answer is yes, and it's already being done. It's proven. Case closed.
Okay, good. Can you guys comment for a minute about the addictive nature? And I'm going to ask you guys to qualify and explain this a bit. Delta 8, Delta 9, and Delta 10. Can you guys offer some insight into that and explain to us what that's about?
Very quickly, a chemist was able to change the chemical composition of THC, which is Delta 9 THC. And when you change the composition, you completely change the nature of the substance. And we're now seeing things that are pretty scary with the other ones, and they're evading the law because the law has not caught up with very innovative chemists. I don't know, Ben?
No, I can't add to that.
I want to say, I do want to say one thing, Josh. I think it's really important. I'm noticing the chat comments, which I invite. We need debate, we need discord, we need discussion. I mean, I went to Oxford. It was all about, you know, arguing with each other, and then afterwards going out for dinner and respecting each other. So absolutely. And in fact, I don't even disagree with a lot of the things that I think folks think I might disagree on. The bottom line here is, and we can't go through all of the comments, but Ben said it right. Ben said it right, which is do your own research, please. And I say this when I go to high schools. I say this when I talk to parents. I say this all the time. Do not rely on me or Ben. Rely on credible, peer-reviewed research and look and see who pays for that research. That's very key. Wikipedia is not a source of peer-reviewed research. I have to just remind people that. Look at the Institute of Medicine report that came out in 2016. Look at statements from the American Medical Association. Look at the Lancet. Look at the New England Journal of Medicine. Look at NIH. Look at credible sources that have been peer-reviewed. Do your and do your research on them. Again, we are not saying that there isn't proper medical use. There is, but it's been totally oversold. I just got to be honest with you, and that's the mainstream scientific opinion. But that doesn't mean that there isn't potential, that there isn't stuff there. All of that. Number one, and so it's just, I think it's very important that, and there's a lot of issues we can't talk, we don't have time to talk about when it comes to the developing brain. We didn't really touch on that, which is a huge issue. I mean, your brain is developing until about age 25 or 30 now, they think. And THC affects certain parts of that in very specific ways. We didn't get to talk about pregnant women as much and the harm to fetuses. The things that we're learning about that is one area that I think is the most underappreciated area right now in the marijuana space, because every time that these studies are very difficult to do, but every time those studies are happening, and again, you should do your research, every time those studies are happening, it's really bad news. I mean, it's not benign. And you know, this again, this constant comparison with alcohol, I gotta just like, it's a pet peeve of mine, because to me, folks, it's like arguing over what's worse, jumping out of the 3rd floor of your building or jumping out of the 6th floor of your building. That's the analogy. They're both bad. Okay, they both have the harms, and maybe they're different harms. Maybe if you jump off the 3rd floor face first, you're going to mess up your body and die in a different way than if you went backwards off the 6th floor. And we are sometimes so caught up in that we're not individually looking at what happens when you jump off the 3rd floor. The 6th floor is really bad, and in some ways it's worse. But forget about that for a minute. The result can sometimes be the same. The 3rd floor is problematic too. And let's talk about that. Sometimes I think we get into very, we get into some of these debates and we go down a rabbit hole. I will say that the final thing I'll say about alcohol comparison is that when the legalization of marijuana movement was going nowhere fast in the early to mid 1990s, right after Just Say No, I mean, nobody was talking about legalizing. It was very far from legalizing then or promoting marijuana. They did a series of focus groups, which was a very smart thing to do. And they said, how can we penetrate the American people and get them to think marijuana is okay enough that they would vote to legalize marijuana? And millions and millions of dollars were spent. And if you want to know about the history of legalization and the money behind it, that's another question. We'll talk about that if you'd like, but that's separate. But they spent millions of dollars and they found two things. One thing they found was that if you made it about medicine, people became compassionate. If you could say that this could help medically, people were okay with it. The second thing they found is that if you could compare it to alcohol and point out a hypocrisy in the law, because alcohol, you see the effects of alcohol every day and they're really bad, but we've legalized that. So why wouldn't we legalize marijuana, which is safer? If you could get that message across, you could legalize marijuana. And by golly, 30, 25 years later, that has been a very successful strategy, and they've done that. It's just very important to understand like where all this has come from. There's a question about THC limits. I'm very much in favor of that. Not everybody is, but I think that if you have legalized in a state, you got to deal with it. I'm not saying that we're going to go ahead and criminalize pot in Colorado tomorrow. No. So we have to do that. But guess who hates THC limits? The marijuana industry. Guess who has fought them tooth and nail? The marijuana industry. They don't want limits. The last thing they want us to do is to figure out how they're getting people so addicted and high to their products to use them every day. And that's why they're fighting limits. And so we are a tiny little group of ragtag group of people with very little money, and they are buttoned up in suits and the tobacco and alcohol industry, and they're able to hire every lobbyist in town. That's why we don't really have THC limits anywhere, because it's a very difficult political game.
I appreciate that, Kevin. One of the things I think that I do want to talk about, because there are, and both you and Ben have addressed this specifically, but I want to talk a little bit more about it because there are some questions in the chat from people who are asking specifically about medical applications and the importance of that, how it has been a significant game changer for a lot of cancer patients, a lot of people suffering from AIDS, neuropathy, different neurological issues. So how do we create an environment where there is solid, practical medical application where people can get what they need and ensure that we're separating the medical from the recreational use of cannabis?
The very easy answer is talk to your doctor, because I'm not that, and Kevin is a different kind of doctor. I also think it's really important that physicians get educated and continue their education on this, because so one of the things the recent law change in Colorado is requiring is cannabis specific continuing medical education for all of the doctors in our state, which I think was pretty progressive and pretty smart thing to do, because as we have established, there absolutely are medical applications for components of the cannabis plant. Let's move away from medical marijuana. And the reality as well is that those components are available in prescriptions from your doctor, in FDA approved prescriptions from your doctor. We can get these things. Now, the hardest chapter on the book that I wrote was the one on medical, because listen, I got the chronic pain box checked. I broke, not including fingers and toes, I've broken 34 bones. I broke my neck. It healed wrong. I live at a 3 or a 4, and some days when it's a 6 or a 7, it's hard for me to think. I understand that. I also, as a father of a special needs kid, understand the desperation and the pain and the hurt that some of these parents have. And I think that, for so many people, there's absolutely nothing that they wouldn't do for their kids. And for those of us who have for decades experienced the pain that comes with just waking up, there's nothing that they wouldn't do. And so I think that those conversations are really important to have with people who care about much more than they care about selling a specific substance. If you talk to a manufacturer of an opiate, they will tell you the opiate will fix it. If you talk to the manufacturer of an antidepressant, they tell you that will fix it. Same thing here. Sit down and talk with your doc and realize that for as shitty as this is for a lot of you to hear, there's no magic pill for any of it. There's no magic pill so that our depression stops. There's no magic pill so that our pain stops, so that our addiction stops. It's a holistic thing, and it's a lifelong journey for many of us who have to use. Me personally, it's medication, psychotherapy, my 12-step groups, stretching, daily meditation and exercise. There's not one thing that's going to fix all of this, but our way, especially our way in this country, is to say, oh, hey, look, I've got this thing that will fix it all. None of those things are a panacea. And if we move away from this idea of hoping to find some silver bullet, some magic pill that will do it all, and we accept the reality that maybe our solution has to be a little bit more complex. Okay. And then with that said, I'm going to end with this great big giant, throw everything I just said away. I'm not going to tell somebody what's right for them. I would encourage them strongly to have that conversation with their doctor as somebody who wants the very best for them holistically. But I'm not going to tell somebody what's right for them, because I have seen people get real help from components of and situations.
I appreciate that, Ben. Kevin?
I don't disagree with any of that. I'm not going to tell somebody either. I'm looking at this more from a public policy point of view. We have something called the FDA. It's not perfect. It takes a while to get a drug approved. But unfortunately, many components of marijuana have failed those very strict guidelines. I mean, they just have. Doesn't mean that they don't work individually for some people. But I do think that, when people rub CBD cream on their knee and get it from God knows where, and it's not regulated, and you don't know what's in that CBD cream, and then a lab tests the CBD cream and finds that there's no CBD in it, which is very common, by the way. And in fact, there's harmful chemicals and pesticides in it. I think that's a problem. And that's happening, by the way, a lot. So, I mean, when people ask me about CBD, I say, all the more power to you. If you think it works, great. I use it if you'd like. But you should also know that it's kind of like buyer beware, because it's not really, there's very little oversight on that market right now. It was legalized as part of a agricultural bill with hemp. There's very little oversight. It's like the supplement industry. You don't really, you have to get your supplements from a reputable source, which is very difficult to determine sometimes. So that I think is a big issue. Again, the evidence with marijuana on medically, when you look at HIV/AIDS, you mentioned AIDS, Joshua. What was interesting is that when marijuana was first being talked about medically in the 80s, it was in the context of AIDS, because THC increases your appetite. That's one of the things it does, which is a good thing if you're in 1984 and you have something called the gay man's cancer and no one knows what it is and you can't eat and you're dying of wasting, then anything to increase your appetite is a good thing. So yeah, marijuana, the component of marijuana, THC, is synthetic, was actually approved under a special authorization in 1985, if you can believe it. It was a Schedule II drug, and it was prescribed and used by doctors in the AIDS population. What's happened since 1985 is a few things. Number one, the best news of all is that nobody is dying of AIDS wasting anymore. Thank God. We have medications, we have HIV antivirals that have stopped wasting and have actually stopped the conditions, life-threatening conditions related to HIV. One of those was Kaposi's sarcoma, where essentially you have sores all over your body. That doesn't exist in the United States anymore. Thank God. It's a huge public health win, by the way. Let's just pause there for a minute and realize what a big deal that is. That's a really big deal. And so the main reason for even the pill of THC, let alone smoking a joint, was the appetite because of wasting. Thank God that doesn't exist anymore. Again, but does that mean that if somebody, for whatever reason, finds some relief and is using it occasionally and not driving and not exposing kids and whatever, is that's a problem in my mind? No, it's not a problem in my mind. I want to be very clear about it. But I think I'm talking about, what does that mean for blanket public policy? Because if you live in a state with medical marijuana, I would think whether you love it or not, you would agree with me that You basically need a pulse and the ability to talk, and you can get a medical marijuana card. I mean, this isn't like some thing where there's some huge evaluation. I mean, some states are better than others. There's no doubt about it. Not everywhere is Venice Beach, California, where you have a woman in a bikini with no medical experience giving you a medical card. Okay, thank God, not everywhere is like that. Some places are more serious about it. East of the Mississippi happens to be a little bit more serious about it. But I will say one thing. I get very concerned when we start talking about things like marijuana to treat opioid use disorder. That isn't the kind of thing that's like, well, it's less harmful. You can't die from marijuana. So like, what's the big deal? It's just like, we should allow it. The science is not there. The science actually says it's much worse. The science says using marijuana could increases your chances. The statistically significantly increases your chances of using more opioids, not fewer opioids. And that's counterintuitive to people because they think like, well, I'll use it and I'll use fewer opioids because I don't need it. When you look at the real data in major journals, again, please don't take my word for it. Please look these up. When you look at the major data, it's the opposite that's happening. It's making that a lot worse. So yes, I agree with Ben that like, if it works for you, like you shouldn't go to prison for sure. Like you should try what works for you. I'm not saying you shouldn't, but I am saying it is dangerous when as a society and a state, we are actively promoting something for a condition that's going to worsen that condition and that has no business as part of the treatment of that condition. I do draw a line there.
I agree with, and I support that. I understand where you're coming from. And I do want to get back to one of those points, Kevin, but one of the things that I do want to talk about for just a moment is the work that the two of you are doing with SAM. One of the issues that I see, and I think a lot of treatment professionals would agree with me on, is the lack of education that doctors get out of medical school for issues associated with addiction. How do we increase the level of education for doctors? And is SAM actively engaged in the process of helping the medical community understand the relationship between the drugs that are being prescribed, the push from commercialized pharmacology, and how we actually deal with that long term?
Yeah, I mean, we are engaged. It's difficult sometimes to engage, I will tell you, because it's a lot easier to sweep this issue under the rug. So unfortunately, privately, I get many medical doctor leaders calling me and saying, great work. What can we do? How can we do it? But then when it comes to actually doing that, I got to say it's been a challenge. But it is something that's, I think, it's very important to mainstream this more. I don't know, Ben, if you wanted to add anything to that.
The people who are sort of at the front of the curve are learning more about it. The pediatricians, the psychiatrists, the ER docs seem to be very interested. The book that I mentioned, the Cannabis in Medicine and Evidence-Based Approach, is my understanding now required learning for all med students in this country. So I think we're getting there, but the important part about that book was it doesn't just say cannabis. It doesn't just say medical marijuana. What is medical marijuana? Like, let's stop. We got to stop oversimplifying this stuff and look at it in the complexity that it actually is. So doctors are certainly beginning to get more educated on the subject. And as I mentioned, the state of Colorado now requiring minimum hours of education that are cannabis specific is really encouraging. And maybe some other people will.
And a couple of things, because I don't want the chat stuff to go away. I think it's important to have the conversation. First of all, I'm not saying that marijuana is worse withdrawal than something like methadone or Suboxone. I think they're very different. But I think if anybody can talk about that, Ben can talk about when you have somebody coming off of an opioid or a methadone versus when you have somebody maybe coming off of marijuana, the differences in the withdrawal. Maybe Ben, if you don't mind, Joshua, I'm just asking Ben a question. If you want to comment on that, Ben, based on your experience. But by the way, I wasn't saying that, but Ben, I'd love to hear what you have to say on that.
Yeah, they all suck. Like, and the problem is anybody who says, and I'm not sure what you're referring to, Kevin, I'm not keeping up on the chat. Anybody who says like, well, this is worse than the other, and this is the awesome, like you should come spend a little bit of time in our field where you realize that there's no such thing as a single substance abuser. Everybody's polysubstance abusing for one thing. And yes, in a perfect world, I would take every single amphetamine addict and transition them to cannabis and then transition off of everything. I would take every opiate addict and do that, but it's not how the world works. I don't get to choose what a person's detoxing from. And when people say that and they like oversimplify and they say, well, wouldn't it be better if they were using this instead of this? Yeah, spend a little bit of time on the street. Come down to the front lines where you realize that the academics of all of this go straight to hell the second you start working with somebody who has a substance use disorder. And it's all polysubstance abuse, and it's not about the substance. It's not about the opiate. It's not about the booze. Josh and I are the same. And his thing was booze and my thing was dope. I'm the same as the heroin addict, and I've never shot heroin in my life. I'm the same because I'm not in love with a substance. I am desperate for and need to kill something inside of me that won't stop talking. I need to fix this mental health issue that I don't have the ability to do on my own. I need to fit in with you because, dear God, I'm the only person who feels like this. And when people oversimplify it like that, when they say, well, why don't we just do this instead of this, that instead of the, you miss the very fundamental nature of what addiction is. Addiction is us longing for acceptance, connection, etc., for some sort of relief from this pain in my head that's been telling me since I'm 3, I should just end it all. It's not, am I choosing between cannabis or wine today? That's what they want us to do and to believe. So listen, like, yeah, I would way rather detox somebody from weed than from opiates. But detoxing people from weed also sucks. And it's never an either or.
I cannot tell you how much I appreciate that point.
Me too.
And I'm not trying to push any particular philosophy or approach or theory, though I tend to really love this theory. Johann Hari is one of my favorite speakers, and he talks about the opposite of addiction not being recovery, but the opposite of addiction being attachment and engagement, right? So when you talk about detox, we're delving into the world of treatment. What are the complications and what are the impacts? How do we respond as treatment providers and mental health practitioners to be able to address cannabis use disorder?
Kev, can I run with this one for a minute?
Please, you're on a roll. I'm listening.
We've been learning a lot about this, and I would like to preface what I'm going to say by treating substance use disorder is treating substance use disorder. What we end up with a lot of the time are folks who, when it gets too specific to the substance, I think a lot of the time it gets gimmicky. Because like I said, addiction isn't about a specific substance. I have very dear friends in my life who have used sex and intimacy in the same way I use substances to escape. So addiction is way bigger than just a substance. However, there are idiosyncrasies to treating different kinds of addictions. And again, those of you who work inside of this field know that you need to approach the person with an amphetamine addiction different than with an opiate disorder. They're a totally different profile. And it's not just as simple as one wants to do this and one wants to do this. In the same way that there are idiosyncrasies to treating the person who began on illicit street opiates versus the person who began following an injury with something that their doctor prescribed and ultimately overprescribed. So there are idiosyncrasies to treating one disease, that disease being substance use disorder, alcoholism, etc. What we've learned in the last couple of years about this are, and I'm going to summarize a lot of different things that I have written and other people have as well. So I'm not going to reference them and give you all of this. Let me just summarize it and tell you, I'd love to send you this information. Get that book. It's a medical textbook, so it's way too expensive, but whatever. What we know is that it takes a very long time to find a baseline for people. What we see a lot of the times are 3, even 4 weeks until we can determine where true psychiatric baseline is for somebody, because we can't start to figure out and treat the underlying mental health disorders until we have fully removed the influence of THC. And we're finding that taking a very long time to do. So that's lesson number 1. 2, we know that it's easier for people to kick THC than it is any other substance, except for some psychedelics, but it is harder for them to maintain sobriety from that than any other substance. And the reason why I believe, and here's just an opinion thing, is it's a cultural deal, because we send them back out into a world very unprepared to deal with the reality of how cannabis interacts with society. Because I've never seen a person, so we talk to them about substances and then we send them back out into the world, and then they go out. And have any of y'all ever seen anybody wearing a heroin hat or like meth socks? So they go back out into a world that's very different. If we all sat here for the next 20 minutes, I'll bet you we could come up with 1, maybe 2, if you're really well viewed, 2 movies that discuss intravenous heroin use in addition to that. Like, okay, let's move away from Train Spotting and Basketball Diaries, and let's look at the entire genre of films that we refer to as stoner comedy. That every time you turn on the news, you see what I like to refer to as drug porn, which is somebody using that thing. I love any news article about opiate addiction that doesn't show clear liquid in a syringe being replaced by blood, where we can actually just talk about these things. So I think we send people back out into a world unprepared to interact with a world that does not see cannabis as a problem. If I tell my family I'm going to treatment to get cured off of the bottle, they're all rallying around me. If I say, oh, I got to quit smoking meth, everybody's like, dear God, yes, please. I got to stop shooting smack. Yes. But if I say, I got to stop smoking weed, the first thing you're going to hear from everybody in your peer group is, what the hell for? It's not addictive. It's never killed anybody. It's not a problem. It can't be a problem. And then you're going to have all these constant negative reinforcers. So I think as treatment providers, one of the things that we've done on the disservice side is send people back out into the world expecting that they will receive the same respect and support that users of other substances do, when they're going to go back out into the world and people are going to sort of laugh and ha ha ha, weed. So here's a total soapbox thing that I'd like to just beg you professionals in the room to consider. Please ease up on the microaggressions. Stop making people who come to you for use for problems with cannabis use disorder feel like they're second class, like they're not. Stop saying things like, oh, it's just weed. You know, if you want to say that, you can keep saying things like, well, you're pretty smart for a female. Stop with the microaggressions. It's not just weed. If they're there to see you for this, it is ruining their lives and destroying lives inside of families. Stop asking them if they've ever actually used any real or hard drugs. My definition of hard drugs, the same that actually Amsterdam adopted about a decade ago, is that if you have to smoke it on a superheated needle, if it comes in rock form, I'm going to go ahead and call it a hard drug. But can we stop differentiating in the same way that I would never put the wine drinker below the vodka drinker? A person who's coming to us for treatment with this substance use disorder, let's respect that and let's hold them in. And even one of the things I'd encourage is remember that they may have had to fight their way through a lot of opposition and people not agreeing that it could be a thing before they get to us. I've sort of shifted what I've been talking about the last year and has been spending a lot more time training clinicians on what we've learned to treat. And that's the central part to the whole thing. Respect that they've got this as a very real addiction. And please, please, please keep learning about what we know on the treating it, because there's more, but you know, it's kind of complicated. And listen, here's a total unapologetic plug. Give me a ring. like, give Tommy a ring. Some of you who know me are like, oh yeah, give him a ring. That'll totally work. But if you call me and you want to talk about like, hey, we want to pay you some money to give a talk, yeah, I'll call you back within the next month or two. But if you call me and say, I got a patient, I got a friend, I got a niece, I'm going to call you back in 2 minutes. And feel free to ask how we can do it. And Tom Walker, ask us, because those of us who are on the front lines of treating this, we're desperate to share this information with you.
Thank you, Ben. I appreciate that. Kevin, do you have something else you want to share?
No, I think that was very well said. I have nothing to follow. I can't follow that.
All right. Kevin, you did mention that there are other options about, there's a spectrum between legalization and decriminalization. So, and we may have to remove the medical piece from this, right? Keep it abstract. What is the spectrum? What lies between legalization and criminalization that is a healthy approach in your mind?
Yeah, well, I think first of all, what we don't want is, I think you all know what I've said. I think I don't want, which is criminalization or promotion and legalization. Okay, so what do we want? Well, we want, first of all, medical research to happen so that we know a lot more about what marijuana can do, both positive and negative. We want medication development for people that could benefit from it. But I think we need absolutely to use a science-based campaign to discourage initiation. I mean, the best treatment is prevention. Let's be honest. So how can we have science-based awareness campaigns? If you are, caught with marijuana, let's say in public, and that's usually how people are caught, or on a traffic stop, let's find out if that person has a drug problem. Not all of them will, but for those that do, let's actually have treatment available. Let's actually have brief interventions available. Let's make sure that we engage the community in a loving way, but in a way that we want to get that person into recovery, which of course means more than just not using, as you said. So there are a lot of things we can bring to scale and build up that we just have not done at all. We've really either said we've just basically said we don't want to hear about it. I mean, that's kind of what we said. We said we don't want to hear about it unless it gets so bad that you have to figure out how to get yourself help. That's what we've said. That's been and we're surprised we have 100,000 plus deaths. I mean, we should not be surprised at that at all, because that's been our whole approach to drug policy. So I think there is a lot that we can do, whether it's, people want to pretend that the criminal justice system has no place in this, and maybe I'm being controversial here, I hope not, but 70% of people convicted of non-drug crimes, I'm not talking about drug possession, non-drug crimes, 70% of them have at least a dependence or a substance use disorder. Well, what does that mean? It means that these are people in the system that we can help today, but we sort of don't want to talk about that. And we don't want to reform probation to make it work better. We don't want to bring to scale things like drug courts, rather taking it from a boutique program that serves 20 people to actually a program that's part of the system that can serve the entire community and work with treatment. There's a false dichotomy that criminal justice and public health can't work together. They can, and they have to, if we actually want to make a dent in this. I mean, we can wish away the criminal justice system and say, we don't want it to have any part because addiction is a disease, but wishing it away doesn't make it not true. It's part of it because it's part of the majority of people in the system for non-drug offenses. So we got to get them help. We have to, we can't have this revolving door. And I think that's part of marijuana policy too. And I agree with Ben, ironically, even though Sam focuses on marijuana, I agree that this isn't about one substance or another. I mean, we happen to focus on that from a policy point of view, from all right, we want to stop dangerous policies and promote good policies with regards to marijuana, because people are talking about marijuana policy now. That's that's the niche of Sam. But you zoom out and you have to realize it's not about the substance or not. I did notice somebody also, if I may, Joshua, brought up one of my favorite subjects, Dr. Carl Hart, who I've debated before and I know well. And we don't have all the time to get into the nuances, but I think that what he's saying is extremely dangerous. And I think it's causing directly lives being torn apart. And I'm not mincing words. Why do I think that? Because I think when somebody is saying that basically the worst part of drugs, that basically drugs are really not that bad for most people, and so therefore we should use them. Again, I don't disagree with some of the premise that the majority of people who try drugs will not become addicted to it. I don't disagree with his premise, but it's the same thing as saying the majority of people who speed won't get into a car crash. That doesn't mean we should encourage speeding. And I feel like he's encouraging drug use. I mean, his book is called Drug Use for Grownups. I think it's incredibly destructive. And he is thankfully completely on the fringe of science on this. So, yes, he has a lab that looks at drugs in the brain, but so do about 1,000 other people in the United States and tens of thousands around the world. I mean, he's not the only one doing that, but he's the only one saying what he's saying, and it gets press, it gets in the news. You haven't heard of the majority of people with drug labs, have you? No, in a university, but you have heard of him because he's been on TV. And when you say outlandish things, you get on TV. It's like the guy running for Senate in Louisiana who was kind of an unknown until he did a 37-second commercial with him smoking a huge blunt and saying, we're going to free this plant. It's so beneficial. And I'm running for Senate. That got him on TV. He was on CNN. No one had ever heard of him before, but he was on CNN the next morning at 8:30. He was also on MSNBC. He was also on the Yahoo. He was also on the Drudge. I mean, he was on every single news thing. So it's a great thing to get publicity. I don't doubt some of Carl's sincerity, but I think it's extremely problematic when you're a professor dealing with controlled substances and dealing with 18-year-old kids at Columbia and Barnard saying that drugs aren't a big deal. And by the way, I have used drugs like heroin while working, and I have used drugs like different amphetamines that have been furnished to me by NIH and taxpayers for laboratory use. I don't think it's funny. I think it's extremely irresponsible, and I think it's very destructive. And so that's where I am with that. Was there what else? We don't want to leave anything else unaddressed.
On that topic, when we talk about legalization versus decriminalization, one of the examples that I often point to is one that I've watched very closely over the course of the last few years. Portugal went through an enormous change in their political and their social approach to addiction and treatment. Can you talk for a second about what Portugal has done and what you see as the objective outcomes there?
I love talking about Portugal and Oregon. So Ben's sitting back because he knows that I love talking. Talking about the history of drug policy or Portugal or these things, I love talking about it. But here's what happened. In 2001, Portugal had one of the worst, and traditionally has had, next to Switzerland and Germany, one of the worst overdose problems in Europe. And so they said, we want to try something different. And for them, something different meant we are going to change the system when you get caught with a small amount, of any drug. What does that mean? It means we're not going to put them through the criminal system. We're going to put them through an administrative system. It's actually a system that does not exist in the US. They have a separate civil and criminal. It's like an administrative system. Well, what does that mean? It means that the person caught with drugs has to go in front of a 3-person, usually, panel who assesses that person's drug use and decides whether to recommend treatment, an intervention, a fine, nothing, supervision, something. And there's follow-up and accountability. But guess what? That was not the most important thing Portugal did. The most important thing Portugal did was invest more resources into treatment than any country with that from a population perspective in Europe. So they said, we're not only going to put them through a separate system, that's the small thing of what we're going to do. The big thing of what we're going to do is put a ton of money in quality treatment and follow-up. Okay. What happened after 2001? Well, in the US, legalization advocates, like from the Cato Institute, which is a far-right libertarian think tank, said, oh my God, Portugal is doing a revolution. They're not arresting users. They are, giving them alternatives. And that's why we should legalize drugs like they did in Portugal. People like me heard that reaction and was like, that's ridiculous. Did they even legalize drugs? That doesn't sound right. And when you actually look at what they did, they didn't legalize drugs at all. The supply of drugs are completely illegal. If you buy drugs in Portugal, you're buying from the illegal market. That's the only market that exists. They didn't legalize drugs, but it was being portrayed as they legalized drugs, and we should follow that model. Okay. Fast forward to now, what has happened? What has happened is they have had mixed results, but overall their overdose rate fell. Their initiation rate has gone up a little bit. I don't know if it's because of the policy or not. But I would say overall, like if I had to give it a grade, I'd give it like 60-40 good, like majority good, but not all of it good. Okay. How much of that is attributable to the policy? I don't know. And how much of that is attributable to the treatment is anyone's guess, right? But they did that. Look at the US. The US, Oregon voted last year to do what they called the Portugal model. So at first I thought, great, we should have a Portugal. I think, having assessments and referring to treatment is a great idea. Then when I looked at what Oregon was actually proposing, it had nothing to do with Portugal. It actually was basically you give someone a $100 fine, which they're not even doing, or you tell them to call a 1-800 number to get help. There's no accountability and there's no investment in treatment. And as I said earlier, the early results show that fewer than 1% of people going through the system in Oregon ever got treatment. But they touted it as the Portugal model and treatment over incarceration. So when they touted it like that, 60% of people voted for it in Oregon because it was treatment over incarceration, which most of us like me can agree on. And so the bottom line is mixed results, a lot of misperception, and Portugal did not legalize drugs. I still get a phone call once every 4 years from the Portuguese drug czar. He's been the same drug czar for 20 years. So he was there in the inception. And he says, Kevin, please tell your fellow Americans, we did not legalize drugs. Please. I keep reading everywhere, the US should try Portugal's approach and legalize drugs. It's driving me crazy. We did not do that. We invested in treatment and we put them through a separate system, a non-criminal system, but a separate system to get them help. In Oregon, you're just giving them a phone number and hoping that they call. That's not the Portuguese approach. So there really is a big difference in what they're doing. And I think, should the US follow the Portuguese model? I think there's a lot we can learn from it. I think that, again, I would love your thoughts, frankly, and I would truly, maybe in the chat, you can talk about it. I would love your all's thoughts on this notion of accountability in treatment, because I don't mean accountability like if you don't come to treatment, you're going to get go to, get some huge penalty of some sort. But it's the disease of addiction to me is a disease of denial. It's a denial on all fronts: denial by the individual user, denial by society, denial by the family, especially if you're talking weed, right? Because I'm sure Ben gets the phone calls, oh, thank God it's weed and not fentanyl. I mean, that happens all the time. So it's denial, 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 denial. What that means is, we got to have some hard discussions about accountability and treatment. And I would love some, but we don't have a treatment infrastructure. Let me be very, very clear. People are talking about safe injection rooms. You can put as many safe injection rooms as you want, but until you have treatment on demand, free treatment, until you have the healthcare and follow-up and housing and supportive recovery support, the idea that you're going to have, a model of harm reduction that you can refer people to treatment, if there's nowhere to refer them to, good luck. I mean, the same goes for drug courts. You can have 1 million drug courts. If you have nowhere to put anybody in terms of treatment, it doesn't work. So that's the infrastructure that we don't have. And the result has been such a fraction of spending on addiction than any other health issue, even though substance use disorders are the #1 cause of over 70 health conditions, cost society more money than any healthcare issue. And that is, and instead, folks, we are looking for simple silver bullets like Narcan and injection sites. I'm all for Narcan. We should have Narcan everywhere. Of course we should have Narcan. We want people to be alive. You have to be a heartless person to say no Narcan. Of course you should have Narcan. It doesn't encourage young people to use. It's necessary, but it's like using a defibrillator with someone that has heart disease. It's the immediate acute thing. It's necessary. You need the defibrillator. But what do you tell the person who walks out of the hospital with heart disease? You just say, here's a defibrillator? No. You say, how do you lead a better lifestyle so you can reduce your chance of a heart attack and you don't have heart disease anymore? You don't just say, here's a defibrillator or here's a big Band-Aid. You don't do that. And in this country, we've looked for silver bullets, whether it's pot legalization, whether it's Narcan. None of those things are going to reduce the overdose levels and what we're seeing without a huge investment in prevention and treatment to actually not, so we can have fewer people needing to use Narcan. Because the stat that I heard is something like 20% of people administered Narcan will end up dying within a year. Well, what the heck does that mean? It means that Narcan is not enough. We can't just give someone naloxone and say we're done. But that is actually where we're going on national policy, because leaders want bumper stickers. I was once told by a politician, I won't tell you which White House, but a very famous person. He said, Kevin, if you don't have a bumper sticker, I can't sell it. Put it on a bumper sticker. It has to fit on a bumper sticker. I can't sell a policy unless it does. Sadly, this issue is not one for the bumper sticker. Final thing I will say, the book I was talking about, that were Carl Hart, I think is extremely dangerous, is called Drug Use for Grownups. It's different than his biographical book called High Price, which is more about his own personal journey. But Drug Use for Grownups, believe it or not, it's something like, life and liberty in the land of the free or something. It's actually much more of a libertarian argument. Drug Use for Grownups is the book that I had a big problem with, in case you want to know. And my book's called Smokescreen, very different. But anyway, that's my take on Portugal. I talked about more than Portugal there, sorry, but I wanted to finish that point.
No, I appreciate that. Ben, do you have anything else you want to share on the topic? I've got another question for you behind this.
Very briefly, Portugal, Uruguay, etc. Whenever people ask those, I try to remind them where they come from. One of my favorite songs that I think summarize it really well, a guy named Joe Pug, you come from the nation of heat. Like, we come from a country that does everything bigger, faster, better, stronger. You come from a country that worships celebrity and achievement. And you come from a country that is dependent to some degree on industrialized prison systems. You come from a country that racism is inherently built into the way we see things because we were built on slave labor. You come from a country that is different than Uruguay, and you come from a different country, and you got to recognize that the American way, the bigger, faster, stronger now, isn't going to do the same thing that they're going to do, because we're not going to plan 10 years down the road. That's my encouragement. This is a different place than 5 million people who are 80% Catholic.
Yeah, I agree, and that's a huge point. Culture is a total. We don't talk about culture enough with regards to outcomes. Culture can affect behavior and outcomes much more than any public policy. And Ben is exactly right.
I'd agree. I think we've learned in this country repeatedly, whether or not we actually make any different changes as a result of it, we've learned that we can't legislate morality and expect a positive outcome. So Ben, this is a question for you, and this is something that has been prevalent in my mind. It's been talked a little bit about in the chat, and I'm sort of breaking both of our anonymity in the process, not that we wouldn't do so on our own. When we look at 12-step programs, there's become a segmentation of Alcoholics Anonymous versus Narcotics Anonymous versus Marijuana Anonymous and Cocaine Anonymous. So we've almost specialized based on the substance of choice that addicts and alcoholics come to for continued support and fellowship. What are the things that we can do better in 12-step programs to be more supportive and engaging, understanding that the face of addiction has changed over the course of the last 100 years or so?
Live by good 12-step principles and stop taking everybody's damn inventory. Like, that's what I'll start with. I mean, listen, the only one that I'm comfortable saying some absolutes around are this whole, like, this is what sober means to me, you know, our California sober thing, or I'm not cool with that, because sober is a word with a definition. And if you're continuing to get high on a different substance, you're not in the same club as I am. But other than that, like, when it comes to people who are really looking for sobriety and maintaining abstinence, I think we could all benefit a lot from just principles before personalities, and taking less inventory. If a person comes into, I grew up, you know, I got sober in 1996. And there were definitely still times there where you couldn't say addict or drugs inside of an AA meeting. And I have been in AA meetings even in the last couple of years where they'll say those sort of things. I'm a big fan of going to all of them. You know, when I put some real time underneath my belt, AA was a little bit more helpful for me in a lot of ways, because I found other people were in the same situations. I still go to NA meetings. I think the great thing about MA, Marijuana Anonymous, CMA, Crystal Meth Anonymous, Cocaine Anonymous, is that there's camaraderie and acceptance there that sometimes is really beautiful and welcoming for that newcomer. And on the MA side of things, like, you know, when a guy's going to go to a meeting and walk in there and feel self-conscious about saying it was weed because he's hearing all these crazy horror stories about overdosing and being brought back. And if we can break down any of the stigma that they have going in and make them feel more comfortable by going to an MA meeting first, awesome. Like, dear God, let's do that. Same smart recovery, from smart recovery all the way to what's the Christ-centered one? Celebrate recovery. Like, all of those, fantastic. And I think for those of us who are in the rooms, our answer isn't to tell people what it is and isn't okay, except for that one sober thing. Sober means something. That's a real word, unless you're sponsoring them. And if you feel the absolute need to tell somebody how to go about their recovery, offer to be their sponsor, and then maybe that can work out. But I'm great with as many different offshoots is the 12-step world as we could ever ask for, because I think they move us all to the same direction. And that same direction is, well, with the exception of maybe our smart one, which has a different 12th step, having had a spiritual awakening as a result of these principles. What we try to do is take what we know to those who are still suffering out there. And it doesn't really matter the specifics, the who's and the what. So that's what I'm a pretty big fan of. And again, whichever version of that works for you, I am fully and completely. In fact, in 1 week, I went with a sponsee about 5 years ago. In 1 week, I went to a Celebrate Recovery meeting at a church where they like sang to Jesus. And then the next night we went to a Smart Recovery meeting where we don't say that. And it was fantastic. So those of us who are in the rooms, less inventory taken, more support.
I appreciate that. I want to be respectful of everyone's time. We have about 5 minutes left. And I wanted to make sure that Ben and Kevin, first of all, thank you both very much for your time and your commitment and your agreement to be here and talk with us this morning. I wanted to offer you the chance for closing thoughts and any final comments that you wish to share with us.
Kev, I'll defer to you on that one, man.
Well, look, I want to thank everyone for listening and having us. I'm not sure. I don't think this was recorded, which is too bad. I wish we had maybe somebody did, but because I think it was a great. Oh, you are good, awesome. Okay, I just didn't see it on my side. Wonderful. I think it's this has been a really helpful conversation, even for me. I love all the comments. I mean, and the chat, we can't get to everything, but there were questions about psychedelics and hallucinogens, which I think is a huge issue on the horizon. I share the same view I do on marijuana. Proceed with caution. Could have helpful uses, should be done within a medical context, not in a let's open a mushroom dispensary next to a liquor store and advertise, gummy flavored mushrooms or something. So, we should do it the right way. And that's the way I feel. I absolutely appreciate the work that everyone does here, whether you agree with me or not on all of my points. You all are on the front lines. You are living these horrific numbers that policy people like me sort through every day. Yesterday, I went through the Bureau of Justice Statistics survey on prison inmates, 35,000 prison inmates surveyed about their drug issues. You all are the ones dealing with folks like that every day, not just numbers. And it means a lot to me. You can learn more at learnaboutsam.org. I will also tell you, and if you hadn't maybe figured it out with what I was saying, we are also beginning to look at all substances at SAM in terms of a policy organization to promote good policy, balanced, science-based policy, because I am very worried about a movement to legitimize all substances and basically delegitimize treatment and pretend we want treatment without actually funding it. I think that's horrible. That's what's happening in Oregon, and I'm very worried about that. So we at SAM are actually thinking about next steps with regards to that. So if you want to be involved in that conversation at all, you or your organization, also, even if it's not marijuana, please reach out. And always a pleasure to be with my friend Ben. I always learn a lot from him. A very tough act to always follow. I'm glad he had me say goodbye first. So thank you.
Thank you, Kevin.
No idea the inferiority complex, Kevin. I'll leave you with these couple of big things. The criminalization of addiction is a terrible thing. We all agree with that. And I thank God that we are moving away from that with some of these conversations. There have been good things there. However, the justice system does play a role in treating this. Were it not for the justice system, I wouldn't be alive today. Because it was intervention from that in Fairfax County that ultimately changed my life and sent me in that same direction. So no, addiction is not in and itself a crime at all. And I know none of us want to see people locked up just for that. So I'd love it if we could maybe look at treating a little more than just straight up punishing. But again, until we figure out private prisons and the reliance we have on that complex, good luck there. Let me encourage you, my partners in this field, my co-workers, to not oversimplify this subject. Please stop saying weed. Stop saying medical marijuana. Consider the components of, break it down a little bit more, and please continue to learn. Kevin's written books. I wrote a book. Lots of people have written very good books on this, and there's more. So when we stop oversimplifying this entire thing as in theoretical ivory tower, if we do this, then this will happen. We're on the right path, because all things, all of this stuff is connected together in estimation. The other thing is that what I will end with is I'm a huge fan of supportive and respectful debate when we remember what it is we are all actually working towards, which is to reduce addiction, pain, trauma in this country, as well as ruined and lost lives from incarceration and unnecessary justice system involvement. But I often wonder if maybe our country isn't past that. The rhetoric that I see in the politics, the way people scream, Democrats are all wrong, Republicans are all bad. It's just not the case, I don't think. I think that there's a lot of truth on a lot of different sides of things, and I would encourage you to respectfully and appropriately disagree with one another, because the minute I walk into a conversation or debate, even if it's like Kevin, opposite Carl Hart, the minute I walk into there and there's no part of me willing to change my mind, I'm going to stop doing what I'm doing, because we should always be open to learning and growing more. Dogma be damned. Knowledge, respectful conversation, insight should rule and trump all. Thank you, Josh.
Thank you very much, Ben. I appreciate that. And like you, Fairfax County Police Department was responsible for saving my life and probably the lives of others too. So hats off to Fairfax County's finest. To those of you who have joined us today who have asked questions about will the recording be available? Yes, it will. We will send out an email once this is posted so that you can review this and revisit the topic and the discussion. Included in that will be a link to the registration for the continuing education certificates, which will be emailed from Ashley Treatment Centers. And to all of my colleagues and friends here today, thank you so much for joining us this morning. It's been a pleasure to have you here today. And on behalf of all my co-sponsors, thank you very much. Best of luck and have a fantastic day. Thank you.